to, because it's easier for me to present in English, Stephanie. But I'm not going to say bad things about you. I'm going to say everything I know about you is not very much. Well, the only thing I know from personal experience is a very nice person, okay? I'm anxious to listen. Mas é a primeira vez, este é um ciclo de conferências que esperamos que tenha continuidade. Também já temos 9 convidados para os futuros eventos, em que vamos falar um pouco das profissões que podem ser exercidas com conhecimentos em ciências cognitivas e comportamentais. São novas profissões, o mundo está sempre a evoluir, está a abrir portas para utilizarmos os nossos conhecimentos para ajudar a sociedade ou acrescentar valor à sociedade e, portanto, também uma escola como esta deverá estar a par dessas profissões e apresentá-las publicamente para toda a gente poder conhecer. Esta profissão de UX Researcher, que é a profissão de fazer a investigação sobre o utilizador e não sobre produtos, as empresas começaram a perceber que estudavam muito os produtos e as características dos produtos, mas sabiam pouco sobre os utilizadores dos produtos e havia vantagens em obter esses conhecimentos. E esta nova profissão cresce não integrada na psicologia, mas também necessitada dos conhecimentos da psicologia. É multifacetada, apoiada por vários conhecimentos, saberes, e, portanto, como também apoia-se no conhecimento da psicologia, é bom que a psicologia a conheça e possa intervir com ela. A Stephanie é uma dessas pioneiras de começar e abrir as portas a esta nova profissão. Desde 2003, ela está a trabalhar na Primeira, Nature, que já toda a gente sabe o que é esta empresa, que com mais de 65 anos publica das mais conceituadas revistas nesta área, mas antes ela tem um percurso dentro mesmo desta área profissional, em que começa a apelar a que as empresas comecem a se centrar no cliente e a estudar as características dos seus próprios clientes e à custa disso e a querer definir a necessidade destes estudos, ela escreve um guia prático UX Researcher, que é um dos best-sellers destas áreas. Portanto, eu diria que é quem abre uma das portas ao conhecimento prático deste saber. Ela já trabalhou para o governo também, dentro destas áreas, e, portanto, tem um currículo enorme dentro desta área, em termos profissionais, mas é agora como diretora dos serviços UX Researcher dentro da Springer, que a convidamos para vir aqui partilhar a sua experiência connosco. So, really welcome, and we will talk again in the final.
And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today as well. At the risk of repeating some of what might have been said, apologies, I have very limited Portuguese. I'm currently the UX research operations lead at Primeira, which is a very old scientific publisher. So I have been running that team for about 3 years now, and that's very much helping other people to do research to make sure it's good quality research, and we're doing it well, and we're doing it effectively. But I've spent almost 2 decades in the field of user research and user experience, first in academia, and then moving over to industry as well as government. And for a couple of years, I was running the user research team in Government Digital Service, which is responsible for Government UK, which we'll talk about a bit more later. And I wrote a book about user research that's supposed to be a practical guide for people who are new to it and trying to learn to do the job. First of all, we're going to start with a definition of what user research is, just to make sure we're all on the same page if you're not aware. So the way that I define user research is really the study study people, users, behaviours, their motivations, their needs in a particular context. Usually it's for when they're using products or using services or having some kind of experience. And the context they have, their behaviours, their motivations, they will affect how they understand and use things in everyday life. And we also try to consider, when we're doing it well, how these things change over time. So when you learn, you adapt, you behave, and how that will change the context you're in and how you're using those services and those products. Market research is something slightly different. It's more about preferences and attitudes, and we do incorporate them into user research, but really we want to be focusing on behaviours and why people are behaving in a certain way.
That's the internet.
So yeah, they're complementary to each other, I would say, market research and user research, but they have different objectives and different outcomes. So these days, user research tends to be most commonly found as part of the user-centered design process. That we tend to use a multidisciplinary team to work together to understand, build, and design and deliver a thing. And that we measure it, we evaluate it, and then those learnings iterate the product. We bring the learnings back in, we keep on improving. But we're really trying to understand how to reduce risk, how to carry on regardless, how to reduce the risk, like reduce the number that we don't know what the users are thinking and feeling and what they need from what we're trying to build for them. And we're trying to make evidence-based decisions and use that evidence to advocate for building in a user-centric way. So we're building the right thing first time around, hopefully, rather than just making assumptions and building, oh, we think we know already what people need, we'll just build this, and it turns out it's the wrong thing.
So perhaps we should wait a minute.
Yeah.
To see your slide, that's most important. Great.
Não sei, da internet. Mas eu estou ligado. Agora sem sofrer um público. Mas é preciso falar com uma pessoa. Eu espero que isto foque em si. Não, ela pode falar. Mostra o slide. Sim, sim, sim. Enquanto não consegue mostrar o slide, não pode fazer. Não. Então, isso vai. Partilhar isso. Não se consegue partilhar. Tem que ser. Não pode ser.
Se querem, podem estender.
Não, não é por isso. É a internet que está a falhar.
Sim, mas para que ela continue a apresentação é bom que se puderem.
Eu vou continuar.
Thank you.
É só para ela continuar.
Eu sei apresentar, mas não se, não, ela não me vai conseguir pôr a janela.
Tem 5.
Someone will know something how to solve things. That's a good thing of university. That's someone. They are left away. Okay. Thank you. Obrigada.
Yeah. So I'm going to start off with some examples of how user research is used within the UK government. So when we're talking about benefits for society, the government should be always working towards that. I worked in UK government for 5 years, And some of this is my own experience in taking case studies from work that colleagues did. But just to give a little bit of background on how government works in the UK, because I think each government is slightly different. And I just want to be able to frame sort of the different places that they're using user research at the moment. So obviously we have Prime Minister, I'm sure it's been in the news quite a lot lately, all the things that are going on. But they're ultimately responsible for all the policies and all the decisions that go on. And part of the government's remit is to oversee the civil service, which was the place I was working. And the civil service are doing the practical and the administrative work of the government. And the Prime Minister will have a cabinet or a group of ministers who are responsible for each of the departments, and they are in turn responsible for the policies that they put into practice. We also have a bicameral system, so we have the House of Commons where all the ministers are, MPs, and we have the House of Lords that's scrutinising what the government's doing, supposedly to keep them honest and make sure that things are going well and make sure that legislation gets implemented in the right way and that ideas are turned into policies that should be a benefit for all or for a particular group. But ultimately, the government and Parliament are responsible for agreeing the final versions of policy and the legislation, and then the civil service will go and implement those policies. And part of what I want to talk about now is how we involve citizens in policy making. So they call it user-centred policy design in UK government. We're going to look at how research feeds into this process and why it's important. So yeah, user-centred policy design involves citizens, users of services, or those people who the policy will impact. And ideally we're doing that at every point in the policy making cycle. And it's been around in the UK government for about 9 years, but it's only starting to become more common now. For a long time, it was just one department who had one team, but it's gradually increasing. So I would be sharing a case study from the Ministry of Justice, the Tax Department, the Education Department, the Work and Pensions Department, are all starting to think about user-centred policy and how understanding citizens and the people impacted by the policy can help us implement policies that will actually benefit them rather than just putting a policy in place, hoping that it will work, which we did a lot of in the past. And working at government digital service that's thinking about the services we deliver to deliver that policy intent, I saw a lot of teams struggling to implement policies that just didn't work for users. They're trying to find creative ways around to make the service usable, but it's very hard to make a usable service if policy is fundamentally wrong. And you can't fix that with a digital service, but they tried. So the user-centered policy design process involves service designers, so different kinds of designers, a user researcher, and subject matter experts, depending on what policy is related to, and policy advisors, all working together, bringing their perspectives and their expertise to then figure out how to generate ideas, how policy should look, how it can practically be implemented, and how it's going to benefit the citizen. So we're going to look at a specific case study now. And I'd say this is from the Ministry of Justice that looks at modernising the courts and the judicial process. And they're trying to create a rehabilitative system in prisons and probation. Still have a long way to go, but they're certainly trying. And this is a case study from 2015. And so just a little bit about the Ministry of Justice. So they had a team looking at user-centered policy design. So it's about 2018, 2019. And this particular case study, they wanted to look at how to support people who have legal issues, but try and prevent them from escalating. So hopefully they won't have to go to court, which is very expensive, it's very time consuming. Can they put services in place and help people figure out their own legal problems rather than having to go to lawyers and like that? And user research was done to understand the people that were having the legal problems and their context and what they did to solve the problems that they were experiencing, and also what barriers were in place when they were trying to solve their legal problems. This is just an example from gov.uk, the different things that the Ministry of Justice cover. The research that was done to inform this new policy and this new service, there was a variety. They used a mixed method approach. They went to advice centres to observe people coming and asking for legal advice. They did in-depth interviews with the advisors, and they also did multiple surveys of citizens with legal problems. They mapped the journey and they identified areas of improvement when it comes to delivering legal support for people. And those insights and recommendations were used to shape a legal support action plan. And this was a commitment by the government department to better coordinate and signpost legal support services, again, to stop that escalation of a problem and it going to court. So this image is of what we call the Citizens Advice Bureau. And this is actually a registered charity. It's not part of the government, but they're very much there to support people in using government services, which is a good example of not all services are really built for the people who are supposed to be using it. You actually need charities to facilitate some of that happening. And as I say, they have quite a wide remit. They will give advice on money and benefits, work, rights, housing, immigration, health, all sorts of things. If you cannot afford to pay for legal advice, this is where you go to seek advice. So going back to the learn, build, measure, it's a continuous cycle, and this is what the team are using to try and understand how to improve the policies and support of people seeking legal advice. And they decided, as they was doing this research, they was trying to understand where they would have the most impact with a digital service. And they ended up focusing on people who were having housing issues. For example, their landlord isn't fixing a problem, or they're being evicted for an unknown reason, and things like that. So they're trying to think about housing, for example, that's in disrepair, and where they can put signposting, what that signposting should be, to help the people find the support they need before having to take their landlords to court, for example, which is extremely stressful and extremely expensive. And they took all the understanding they got from the research and understanding of how people were trying to deal with the problem, what kind of background, what kind of knowledge those people had who were trying to solve their housing disrepair problems. And they fed it into a prototype of the service, and they were testing it to see if it was actually going to work. It resonated with people. And they did several rounds of iteration and testing, and they kept improving each time they learned more. And they had an evaluation framework to measure the success of the service when it was launched, so they could see how much impact they was having on this new service that they were implementing, but also be able to take the feedback from that evaluation to iterate the policy and the service itself. And again, so when their policy changes, they will go through the same process again to understand how the nuances of policy will impact people and what they need to do differently to support people and have that sort of benefit from the society members. So policy is the start of the process in government, and then there's the services that deliver the policy intent. And excuse me, government services very much intended to be used by all members of the community, delivering the policy intent, and it's usually provided by the government for people living within its jurisdiction. You can see that's not actually true. There's a much wider audience, which is one of the challenges of working in government, that technically anybody could be your user, and you have to break them down into understandable groups of people, usually grouped by behaviour rather than demographic, to then understand how we can deliver a service to a certain group of people, but also how do we build that service for multiple groups of people who have different experiences, different access to technology, and all that. So yeah, I worked at Government Digital Service for several years, and this is the department that is responsible for gov.uk, which launched 10 years ago now in 2012. And at the time, it was an award-winning website. It was very different to what had come before, particularly for government websites. And we weren't even thinking in terms of services, we were just thinking in terms of websites. And before we had this, every government department had its own website. It looked very different. They used different terminology. There was no consistency in the way that it was built. So if you was a person trying to interact with the government, you'd have to learn how to use a different website each time, each department that you needed to interact with. What gov.uk did was enforce some standards, bring everything into one website and have consistent language, use language that the citizens are going to understand rather than the internal civil service terminology, the technical words that make it very difficult to know what you need to do. And yeah, as a lot of it at the beginning was just bringing all the content together. But then as we matured, we built more stuff, we could start to think about how to deliver digital services better, and then how to deliver that service in multiple channels and have a consistent experience across different channels. So you're not discriminating against anybody, whether they're using the phone or they're using a website, they're going to get the same level of service. So yeah, the Government Digital Service, or GDS, as we say for short, is very much there to help government work better for users. And we say this because, services aren't really designed for people, or at least they used to not be. It was very much an internal focus. This is what I think needs to be done. But we have, as I was alluding to just now, we have a very large group of people that we're trying to cater to. So the population of the UK is just over 67 million, and that's a lot of potential service users. And it's not just the citizens of the UK living in the UK, they might be living abroad. We also have to think about people who wanted to migrate to the UK, or they're seeking asylum and things like that. So that number becomes even bigger. So yeah, we don't want to think of them as one amorphous large group of people. There's many different kinds of people that need different levels of support within that population. And they have different experiences, they have different behaviour, motivations, and needs and characteristics. And we need to use research to understand those different groups and break it down into something more manageable. Because if we think of them as just one group, you end up making a service or a product that no one can use in the end. And part of the challenge of working in government is, but it's also a good thing, like the government is the oldest and largest service provider in the UK, but that means they're very experienced at delivering services, but it also means there's a lot of legacy and a lot of history that we have to deal with. That means that change can be slow. And we spend a lot of money on services. So yeah, 20% of the GDP is spent on services. This is pre-pandemic. It may have changed now, but it's still a lot. And 90% of government money is spent on services. So this is an interesting graph, and it shows how much service spending has increased in the government, and it does show some of the pandemic things that it's really gone up. And I was quite shocked to see the number that between 1997 and 2021, we spent 1,000 billion on services in government. It's not really a number that I can comprehend. It's a lot of money. And this is spending on both the services themselves, but also the support needed to use those services. We have a lot of support services to help other people use them. Yeah, so government's been around for a long time, our services have been around for a long time, and they definitely weren't designed for the internet. We had to rethink how things were done. So I have a few examples here. So if you develop a medical condition and you need to stop working, you need to interact with 3 different government departments in order to, for example, get sick benefits and be able to live. And if you need access to medical care, another department. If you want to start a business, you have to interact with 9 different departments. So you also have to know which of those 9 departments you need to talk to, in what order and what for. So we're making it really hard for people to live and work and do day-to-day things. And obviously, you know, in internal focus, it makes sense to break all these things up. But why should citizens know how to do all those things? It's hard enough to run a business as it is, let alone know who you have to interact with government. So what GDS wanted to do is come in and really rethink how it was all done, have a much more holistic approach, and try to make it easier. Incrementally, at first it was a revolution, like there was a very new policy to say we have to do this digitally, we have to do it user-centered, but now it's much more evolution and gradually improving things as we go along. And unlike private sector, people don't have a choice. They have to use government services. Like, we have to pay our taxes. We don't want to, we have to. And we often have no choice. So we really need to make them as easy to use as possible. And there's been a lot of conversation in the last few years about people using services when they're in crisis. So if we have legal troubles, or if they're very ill, or if they're in danger, they will need to use government services, which is an imperative to make them even easier to use if you're emotionally distressed, for example. And also, bad services cost the government a lot of money as well, because we need to provide a lot of extra support to help people use those services. So we go back to the continuous circle of build, measure, and learn. So you can really boil it down to, we do research to understand the users, we then design a thing. We find out what thing we need to design, and then we design it right, and then we test it and analyze it, and we keep improving it. And we talk a lot about being agile, so just learning a little bit at a time and then implementing it rather than waiting for years, learning, and then launching. So we're always trying to do it as quickly as we can. So these are some examples of why people need support using a government service. So like, I don't understand what I need to do, or I'm waiting for a response, it's been 3 months, I don't know when I'm going to get it, so I need to make a phone call, or, you know, I'm an edge, you wouldn't call yourself an edge case, but yeah, my situation doesn't fit the usual, the happy path, or or the government is telling someone, you've made a mistake, you need to fill in the form again. Things like that. These are forms, we call it failure demand. We haven't, as a government, as a service provider, we haven't made it clear enough, we haven't made it easy enough for someone to use that service first time. So we've created a demand for support. And there are many government services, you're not necessarily using them all the time. They could be once a year, it could be once in a lifetime. You need to be able to use it easily first time, with a small learning curve to be able to do that, rather than something that you build up knowledge of over time. Yeah, so a lot of the money spent on services in government is for call centres, for people to call and ask questions about the service they've tried to use online and things like that. So that's where a lot of the money is going. But there's very much the ethos in GDS, that a well-designed public service can improve people's lives. We're giving them access to the things that they need, but also we're saving money, because obviously all that failure demand that we're spending ultimately comes out of taxpayers' money. We need to make them as efficient as possible, as well as enabling people to do what they need to do. We're going to look at a specific case study now. So this is generic public office. It's for processing Chinese citizens applying for visas to come to the UK. This is an example of how much paperwork can be generated by one quite small service. In order to apply for a visa, if you're Chinese and come into the UK, this is the list of things that the government required for you to share with them before they would consider accepting your application. And that's, as you can see, quite a lot of information that they're demanding of you. And some of these things are really sensitive and important pieces of information. For example, the family book is a really important document for people to have in China. So this it's like a residence permit, but for the whole family. And people need this document to access government services in China. And we was asking them to send it to us for potentially 3 months or more. So then we're obviously blocking them accessing services in China, because we want to look at it to process that application for a visa for the UK. So part of the process of doing the research to understand what it's like for users, we also do research with the people who are delivering the service, they're providing the service, to understand, well, why are we asking people to send this very sensitive document to us, you know, thousands of miles away for 3 months? Do we really need this information? What's important about it? The researchers and designers worked together to understand what was the minimum amount of information we could process an application with, and it'd still be a good, a solid process, and it's still fair to everybody. And they managed to get it down to 5 that were essential, which we have at the top here, and then some nice to haves. But the people at processing the applications still wanted that information. They felt more comfortable having information, but they did manage to reduce the amount of paper by 25%. So yeah, in the end, they was able to remove the complexity by doing the research to understand what was required and what the experience for the users were. So part of that was improving the language on the forms, so you could fill it in right first time and avoid mistakes. You have to go back and forth and, okay, you need to give us this information because you've done it wrong first time around. So that also cuts down the time it takes to process the application and actually be able to grant a visa. So it's better for users, it's better for government because it cuts the workload, it cuts down for the people in government processing the applications, and it cuts down the stress of people trying to apply for the visa. So yeah, less effort for the users, for citizens, less effort for the staff, less administration, better response time. It ultimately becomes a more efficient service. And they wouldn't have been able to do that without using research, without understanding exactly what the citizens were going through, also understanding the staff and why they was doing it the way they was. Often when these services have been established for many years, it's like, well, this is just the way it is, rather than stopping and thinking about what is it that we really need to do. It's like, well, I have these checkboxes, I need these things. But then they would really be able to, they really dug down deep and understood exactly what was needed. So if we go back to, this is another aspect of what the governments need to do. We're thinking about accessibility and digital inclusion. And as we're saying, there's potentially over 67 million users of government services, and that's a very wide spectrum. And now people have different capabilities within that, and we need to think about it. So the government has a legal obligation to make services accessible for everybody, no matter who they are. And for that reason, In 2013, they created a digital inclusion strategy. And this was developed around the needs of people who are offline. So those who, even though we're trying to make things more online, we have to acknowledge that there are people that don't have access to this for whatever reason, and they're never going to use a digital service. So how do we provide services for them on the same level, the same experience? And user research was a core part of designing services across multiple channels. And this was to be able to support the Equality Act, and we have a lot of legislation around accessibility now as well. And part of supporting the digital inclusion strategy was the creation of this digital inclusion scale. And it's a 9-point scale that really tries to document people's kind of capability of using digital things. And it was also designed by going out and doing research and understanding across the population, sort of how big are the groups of people who feel like they're experts in using digital and the internet, and those people who are never going to touch it, they never will, they don't trust it. And we've seen like how much in each group so that we could design for them and better understand their capabilities so we can then tailor our services to fit their needs and show really kind of like the potential we have there to design better. And it was used very much to, for the teams that were building the services, to have empathy with the users. So they're not just an abstract person, but we can think about, okay, this is a person that's using a digital service for the first time. They're probably quite nervous and not sure what they're doing. They're going to be anxious. How do we make it as easy and simple as possible to use a service the right way the first time? And they don't need to call anybody, they can just do what they need to do. So when we talk about accessibility, it's quite common to think about it in terms of physical impairment. For example, someone is blind or someone is deaf, things like that, or they have impaired motor skills. But in actual fact, we have situational, temporary, and permanent impairments. When you think about like that, we are all going to have some kind of access need at some point in our life. It may be you're in a loud bar and you can't be heard, or you may be deaf. There are different things. You might have an ear infection, so you can't use the phone temporarily, and things like that. And so, yeah, thinking about situational access needs really broadens out, like thinking about who can be affected by accessibility. And it turns out it's everybody, rather than thinking about smaller populations who have a specific impairment. And we also include in this low literacy and low digital literacy, because that is going to be an access need to using a service as well. So these are some examples. The UK government love to create posters to put in their offices about these things, to sort of, you can walk past in the corridor and remind you of things that you should or shouldn't be doing. So there's been a lot of principles and standards created about what is best practice in terms of creating digital services that are going to be easy to use, whatever kind of access need you have. And they've done specific ones for physical and motor disabilities. They've done ones for different mental disabilities, and there's low vision as well. And the user research is extremely important for understanding these groups of people, and we have to it's been very important to do this right at the beginning, because there was a tendency before the legislation came in that was like, oh, we'll think about that later when we deliver the service. This is an unusual case. There's not going to be that many people who have disabilities that are trying to use our service. But it actually becomes much harder to improve the service once it's live and do these kinds of changes, which is often simplifying things or changing the way that interaction is done. It's better to think of it first time around. And if it's easy to use for the people who have the most access needs, it's going to be easier to use for everybody. So talked a lot about government, and now I'm going to move to thinking about working in the private sector, also trying to benefit society. And it's not necessarily obvious at first in terms of how we can use user research in a private organisation for the benefit of society. So working at Primeira, as I said, they're a scientific publisher, and we don't have the everybody is our user kind of remit, but very much the much smaller group of scientists and people, the librarians, and people working in academia. So yeah, it really narrows it down, but we're still thinking about the impact we have on society and how we can do research to improve that. And sorry, we're very much thinking about Springer Nature's mission is very much to advance discovery, to advance science by publishing trusted research and supporting the development of new ideas and championing open science. So when we're thinking about progression, the communication of science, it's very much for the benefit of society. Yes, we also there to make money, but it's very much about the communication of science as well. Again, we can think about we need to be diverse in both our teams internally and reflect society, also thinking about diversity and inclusion in our users as well. I've heard a long time ago people always saying like, oh, scientists don't have access needs. It's simply not true. It's very much a stereotype of a scientist is a very intelligent, very physically able person. But again, there's a whole spectrum of people within the science community, and we need to think about that when we're building products and services for them. And yes, there is a certain amount of privilege that comes with being a scientist. You've had a certain amount of education, you're part of a community, but there are still important access needs that we need to think about. And this is a very good example that you don't always see of people working in science. So here we have a professor in the lab working in a wheelchair so that the lab has to be accessible to him. And this is my favorite one. This is a support dog that is, I believe it was a chemistry PhD student, so obviously working in a lab with dangerous chemicals, but needed their support dog there as well. So the support dog has to wear protective gear so that they don't get harmed by the chemicals. And we're really not thinking about scientists in this way. So it's really important to have these examples to think about the different levels of need that people have to do their jobs, because scientists are people too. So we need to think about that spectrum. And another way that access needs can vary in terms of scientists is thinking about what they have access to in terms of publications. Do they come from a low income country? Are they from a lower income institution, which means they don't have as much access to the range of publications potentially that they could have? They have to be very selective in terms of what they're buying from publishers like Springer Nature, and also what kind of equipment they have access to. It's extremely interesting. We always try and have international research, so we are not just getting the European or the American perspective from well-funded institutions in rich developing countries, but also doing research with people from India, from countries in Africa. And you will often see, like, there'll be someone in Mozambique who's using a very old laptop and they're connecting to the internet via their mobile, and they don't, or they're doing their PhD on a tablet because that's all they have access to. And we really need to consider that when we are trying to deliver services and products to them. But can everybody access these things that we're trying to provide? And also, scientists might be doing field work. They're in in the middle of a forest and they're having to power their laptop by solar panels and things like that. But they still have administration to do and they still need to publish their work. So they're trying to be creative about how they can connect to the services. And it's also, funding that you get to publish, to do the research, to go to conferences. These are all things that we need to think about in terms of how people can access the things that we are providing. And being able to think about the diversity within the scientific community helps us build better services that better meet the needs of people. And the other interesting thing about being a global publisher with a global audience, we really need to think about cultural differences. So the research team where I work, we are from across 6 different countries, mostly European, but we also have some colleagues in China and in India. So we talk a lot about the differences in cultures. Like I've noticed a lot of differences between UK and cheese culture, for example, and we need to keep that in mind when we are doing our research and make small appropriate adaptations to our research approach, and think about when we are actually doing research with people, if we're asking them what doesn't work about a service for them, are they from a culture that doesn't like to criticize? So they'll just pretend that everything's fine, even though you've just watched them struggle to do a task. They'll say, no, it's fine. I can do it. Maybe other people can't do it, but I can do it, and things like that. So we're really trying to, and if we realise they're from a culture that doesn't criticise, we can tailor our questioning to try and make them feel at ease and try and eventually dig down, create that trust, so they will tell us the truth of what their experience was. So often what people say and what people do, 2 different things, and we experience that all the time in user research, and really having to pay attention to sort of what they're saying, also observing what they're doing and put those information together. And also, we want to make them feel comfortable, so we want to avoid any cultural faux pas. And that's part of the ethics, essentially, of making sure that we're looking after the people that we are asking to do research with us. It's not very good. Sure. But it's just, I haven't covered the methods that we've used in user research. There are a lot of different things in terms of qualitative and quantitative that we use to gain understanding of people in a particular context. But I hope I've shown how user research methods can be part of a larger user-centered design process that we use to generally improve processes, to improve services, or to create them beneficial for members of society. And also in the context of the scientific community, and its sort of less direct impact on society as a whole, but it's a trickle-down effect. So we're still trying to benefit society through the sharing of science and the fair communication of science to progress society and tackle the problems that we're all facing. And this has become particularly relevant. So, for example, Spring Nature made all of their COVID-related research open access, so everybody could access it in 2020, and we're making more and more climate-related, climate action-related research open access, and more people can benefit for it. So we can work better together to solve these problems that we are creating ourselves, but we do need to solve them. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your talk. I will have some time for questions. So, anybody has questions? I have one. When you work with, you guys have cases where you help service to be more efficient and shrinking the amount of information they really need to make a decision. We have a lot of research about people wanting information that they don't need for anything. So human beings are driven to have information even if they don't need that to support any of their decision, but they will feel more confident and they will think that the decision is much better. So this means that you had to face this problem when you gave this product, when you said to them, this is what you need. How you solve that? How you could deal with that in the other side?
Yeah, some of it is about being very open and transparent with them about what we are learning so that they understand the process that we're going through and as we're learning about what is really needed, rather than sort of go away, do some research and then present some results. They really if we make them a part of the process, they feel like they also own what the results are. So it's much easier to have that conversation of, well, you don't need all this information. And also, it gives them a chance to reflect on their own processes. Like they may feel more comfortable if they have 25 pieces of information, but they're also complaining that they're overworked and it takes too much time and that kind of thing. So reflecting back to them, like, well, yes, you might feel better, but you're also making your own life harder by doing this. And sort of being able to show them what the impact is, having that extra information, getting them to understand why we're doing these things. Really helps, making it a really collaborative process, like co-designing these things together.
Do you feel any problem? Always trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, like, no one likes change, do they? Even if it's change for the better, if it's something that's unfamiliar, it takes time to get used to it. But it's all about sort of how do we communicate those findings to help them see eventually. It will be better. It's definitely resistant.
Thank you. So you mentioned in the section where we talked about working for the UK government, so that's where they really need to ask the users themselves, the citizens, and you mentioned mixed methods, so interviews, survey observations. Do you ever find that sometimes those components go in different ways, since a survey is kind of self-report, observation not so much? How do you deal with that? Do you have already different ways because in the decision process, if you see things going in different ways, you need to make a decision based on one of them.
Yes.
How do you guys deal with that?
Very good point. Yeah. Contradictory information is always going to be a struggle in this. And I think we tend to, so certainly where I am now, I think government as well, if you're senior stakeholders that don't necessarily know about research, you feel better with numbers. So if you have a survey saying 1,000 people said this, they would feel better, but it's educating people to understand that we observe something different. And I think really taking the time to sort of a more ethnographic approach where we're really understanding and seeing what's doing, but that context is more important. So we tend to, even though stakeholders always want numbers, we really advocate for the exploratory qualitative stuff that really involves us observing and working with people rather than just self-reporting is the end you have to take that with a pinch of salt. So what, I was saying what they say, they do often. But I think also having statistical significance, which we don't always pay attention to in user research, is really important. I think that's sort of in talking about learning from each other in different disciplines, getting more robust in quantitative data we have also help. But ideally you're using mixed methods so that the shortcomings of one is bolstered by the strengths of another, but it doesn't work.
Thank you.
You start to meet with an objective that is improved for service. You do preliminary research, find problems, and then you feedback to the service or the team, and you go. And that is several phases. So can you explain more about this process that we go forward and go back and try to clarify some things and communicate better the results?
I guess, yeah, don't like to think of it as forward and back, but more sort of like iterative spiral always going forward. So it tends to be that we do quite a lot of upfront research to really understand the landscape of what's going on in the context of the users and who those users, what that group of users are, and that will give us a foundation of, okay, this is the kind of things we need to incorporate in the building the service. So you understand at the beginning, this is the kind of thing we need to do. And then the iteration comes when you're sort of page by page, you're building a journey of the service. And first we're doing like the big research, and then we're doing the sort of much minutiae, like the tactical stuff of, do they understand this label or this content, this field? Can they do this interaction? And that's where the iteration comes in. But yeah, you're going down to the detail of, is this thing that we're building actually going to deliver what we need it to? But also there's that back and forth in a team, but as an organisation or a group of organisations like the government matures, you start sharing across different departments. And that communication is really important, because it means that once we've looked, something's quite established and we know it's a learning and it's universally true, we don't have to do research on that again unless we think something's changed. So that can also make the process more efficient. We know that this is a very common behaviour, we can design for it in this way, and we're very confident there's low risk there. So yeah, it's important to have wider shift. Don't know if that answers the questions.
So you were talking about the challenge of not seeing people as an amorphous group and having all these layers and people who might even, seek asylum. So there's a lot of variability. So I was wondering, in which ways do you try to accommodate this variability when you're developing this kind of user research and develop the product? And I also had a second question, which is, how did Brexit affect the process?
I'll give it the first question. Yeah, so unless demographics is important to the service, we don't tend to focus on that. We tend to focus on behaviours and capabilities in terms of understanding how people are going to do something and what level of understanding they have, and then we can break it down into that and think about, for example, the difference between professor and an undergraduate and the different levels of knowledge they have. But what we always try to balance is that you're giving enough clear and simple information to an undergraduate, but you're also not annoying a professor who knows a lot more and has done it many, many times. Like, for example, if you're doing grant applications and like that, and trying to balance those things. But we have learned over and over again that, for example, plain language, plain English is actually, everyone prefers it, whether you are a highly trained lawyer or if you're a primary school teacher. Like, it doesn't matter, because we're all busy, we've all got lots of things to do, we've got multiple things on our mind. The simpler things are better. So we tend to try and cater for those who have the most needs, but then balance it with those who have more. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Because when you say, oh, the users are everyone, there's nothing you can do with that. Yeah, you need to start breaking it down into understand more groups of people. And also, a lot of services aren't for everybody. It very much depends on who you are and what your life is. So when we can narrow down to that specific group that service is for, and understanding them, that's what it means. So we can really tailor it to what they need. Brexit, I decided to leave government before Brexit happened. I decided I didn't want to be part of it anymore. But to be completely frank, as they were scrambling around, we lost a lot of expertise by not being able to talk to our European colleagues anymore. There's a lot of, for example, laws that were being passed in Brussels, we didn't have that expertise, and suddenly we had to do it for ourselves. Yeah, we did it to ourselves. Good stuff. It was very unfortunate. Yeah. But, also creating new services or data that we didn't have access to because we didn't have the legal right to anything like that. There was a huge amount of consequences that I don't think makes sense to talk about when they asked to vote. Thank you.
If I can ask I guess, kind of a personal question, why did you, personally and professionally, why did you decide to get away from government work?
Good question. So I did. So for me, I like the working in places where it is benefiting a lot of people, actually trying to make people's lives better. And not to disparage people, like if you're selling jeans or anything, but that's just not interesting to me. To be able to help solve problems, I really enjoy that. But in the end, yeah, I burnt out. The civil service demands a lot of people, and I was doing 3 full-time jobs, just couldn't sustain it. And so I decided, to move on. And I believe in the mission of communicating science and how that can benefit society as well. So yeah, I was very grateful to be able to do this talk because it's very much sort of where I'm coming from in terms of what I do user research. But yeah, it was not the work itself. The work is some of the most interesting work that I've ever done working in government, but it was more the surroundings of what was expected of people, and also represent the world. I don't think we'd be part of that.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask the last question. Nobody.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I do share that idea that some causes are important, you should work towards them. So I did really enjoy the whole presentation. But I'm wondering on the limits of it, and not on the limits of the research, but for example, if we build websites for people to access and have their rights, I'm thinking there's an assumption there that we have people that use websites. My experience in Portugal is that a lot of our population is very old. They do not have smartphone or access to the internet. So these methods, would they extend? Is that something that you guys do in your jobs, going to these people and having to, approach them differently, not just data on a website or? Yeah,
that's a really important point. Certainly at the moment, we're doing mostly remote research. It's international, so pandemic had to. But in terms of particularly the accessibility research in government, it was that we had to recruit in a different way because the easiest way to recruit them is online. But if you're not online, you're never going to find those people. So we had to start working with different charities and support groups to actually be able to access those people. And yeah, particularly people with mobility issues or blind people and things like that, we would go to their homes and see their setup, or if we asked them to come into the lab, we'd ask them to bring their iPad with them, so they have it set up in the way that they like to use it, rather than getting them to use a computer they've never used before, which is going to add barriers, and we're not really going to understand how they can use the service because we've had barriers. So it's very much, yes, doing it in a different way, but it requires us to be much more face-to-face learning.
You know, we hear about user research, and oftentimes it comes accompanied with mentions to big data, etc. But really, there's a whole side of it that is direct interacting, reaching out, and going in person to people. And then,
and the other thing that makes me think of that's really important, it's a conversation we have to have again and again in terms of doing the qualitative research. Obviously, it's a much, because it's labour intensive, it's a much smaller group of people. And being able to talk about sort of like behaviour is actually quite consistent with defined groups. So if you've well defined your group, like if you are a group of people who have recently lost their sight and they're not very digitally capable, the behaviours within that group of people are going to be very consistent. So we can trust small samples. And differentiating between like market research, where you're talking about opinions and attitudes, which are going to vary quite a lot within a group, and having to have large numbers and trying to make that distinction as well has been really important for us to get people to track the data.
May I ask the last question? Okay, my question is that in this kind of intervention and study intervention, how do you evaluate outcome? It's with the people that are producing the system that is now more effective, or are you going back to the users and evaluate if the product is effective?
So they often have key performance indicators of how they want to perform and are they meeting their success criteria. But they're measuring all the time how many people are using the service, how many people are using it first time, correctly first time, or how many complaints they get. So they're tracking a lot of stuff internally, but then they will go back and do research to make sure that it is still meeting people's needs. Have the needs of that group changed? Or the laws and the policies have changed? How's that going to affect it? So they're still, in an ideal world, it doesn't always happen, especially if there's not budget there. But I do will be evaluating both sides to make sure that's actually right.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Obrigado pela vossa presença.